Hello, my name is Simon Hasabi, and I'm here with my partner.
My name is Jason Gibson.
And we are here to discuss our findings. Now, before we begin, I'd like to thank a few people. I'd like to thank Masako for inviting us out here. It is truly an honor to represent my school on such a national level. I'll also like to thank our teacher, Mr. Anaya, for bearing with our tomfoolery throughout this entire journey. And I'd like to thank my parents if they are watching this. And without further ado, let's get into it.
But first, we'd also like to thank Mr. Artegui for joining us on this trip. And we would also like to give a very special thanks to Marissa Friedman. Unfortunately, she could not make it today because of family matters, but she was really the heart and soul of a lot of what went into this, so I'd like to thank her very much. And so now we can begin.
So, as stated before, we are International Polytechnic High School. We are a little school right outside of Los Angeles, California, in the town of Pomona. And we believe that we are the change in the United States. Now, most of us are eligible to vote in 2020 or at the very most 2022. So that means that we can vote on legislation or maybe representatives that can put an end to the use of nuclear weapons in the United States. There have been fights over the decades about, should we use them, should we keep them, matters like that. But, a lot of people don't actually care about this, which is quite upsetting. I'm going to lay down some statistics on you. As you can see right here, we have different cases of atomic accidents. I am not going to focus on the death toll themselves, more of what happened after, or what happened during these deaths, I should say. So in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, most of the radiation poisoning seen actually came from an event of which the smoke and dust mixed in with rain clouds that rose after the bomb's detonation. And because of that, it fell back down as rain, but this was like pitch black rain that was extremely radioactive. In New Mexico, so this was back during the Trinity tests, so they didn't know a lot about nuclear weapons at the time. So because of that, when the bomb went off, there was a cloud of fallout, and that was unfortunately carried across the desert over to a small town near the test site, and 30,000 people were affected by it. In Kazakhstan, heavy testing around an area known as the Polygon led to a lot of people being affected by radiation. The numbers right there are 100,000 people. And in Bikini Atoll, some crew of a Japanese ship, as well as natives, were affected by the Castle Bravo test, in which the bomb actually exceeded the yield that most estimates put. And unfortunately, these natives have not come back to the island due to just the sheer amount of radiation that still remains. And although it is not a nuclear bomb test, we put Chernobyl because it kind of shows the very worst of an atomic accident. An entire city had to be evacuated due to just how radioactive it was and still is to this day.
And so now I will talk a little bit about the pros and cons often brought up when talking about nuclear weapons. So there are many countries, including the US, or especially the US rather, who see nuclear weapons as a benefit to not only their country, but to their relations with foreign nations as well. And this is mainly because many people believe that nuclear weapons are a key to more world peace because they act as nuclear deterrents for other countries who may intend to instigate conflict. Another point often brought up as to why nuclear weapons may not be seen as an issue is because it is assumed that world leaders have the competence, or at least we hope have the competence, to understand that there are dire consequences that not only for their state, but for potentially the entire world if they were ever to initiate a nuclear attack on another country, especially another country who happens to possess nuclear weapons. One example of a defense often aligned with this argument is the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the United States and the Soviet Union backed down from almost launching nuclear weapons at each other because they knew that it would destroy the world. And so people say, well, if two countries who are at odds with each other can understand not to launch nukes at each other, then nuclear weapons aren't that much of an issue. Well, why even have the risk is what I would argue, and now getting into the cons. So nuclear weapons, if one were to be launched, of course, the effects would be catastrophic. What would happen if today a nuclear weapon was used on a population for the first time since Nagasaki? Well, of course, the death toll would be in the hundreds of thousands, if not more, and probably more, because of the fact that countries have advanced their nuclear weapons. Also, humanitarian aid would have much trouble in responding adequately to the situation at hand. Some specific examples of the effects of nuclear radiation include the deterioration of cells in the body, seizures as a result of cellular brain damage, cataracts which form in the eyes when exposed to nuclear radiation, and some longer-lasting effects include DNA mutation, genetic defects in children, and cancers, and specifically thyroid cancer, or primarily thyroid cancer, which is a cancer formed in the throat. And not only do nuclear weapons pose a great threat to humans, but they are also environmentally damaging, so much so that less than 0.1% of the entire of the world's nuclear arsenal has the potential to bring worldwide famines and crush agricultural supply. Even if, hypothetically speaking, there was an absolute guarantee that nuclear weapons would never again be used on a population, the process of the development and testing of nuclear weapons alone poses a major threat to people, specifically those who live near the nuclear test sites. Such is with New Mexico and Kazakhstan. And so, although the notion exists that nuclear weapons help make the world a safer place, the reality is that as countries continue to possess them, mistrust and fear grows among nations, which ultimately leads to global insecurity. And so, while it is very likely that a nuclear attack may ensue in the near future amongst countries, it is not inevitable, or at least I don't believe it is an inevitability, because there are steps to resolution. One step deals with leaders, and leaders around the world need to take more initiative and work with allies to help stop other countries from developing nuclear weapons which could be used. Number two would be to live up to commitment. And so many countries bring up these nuclear ban treaties, but they never actually, usually they don't commit to the treaties, especially those who own nuclear weapons. One example of an exception to the rule would be Iran, which does have many global implications to stopping nuclear weapons from spreading. And although Iran is, in recent years, facing some issues, as Mr. Wolfstall brought up in his speech, they did used to greatly endorse the productivity of nuclear weapons. So Iran stands as somewhat of a role model for other countries to hopefully follow in the future. Number 3 would be to secure materials, and more specifically materials that can be used for making nuclear weapons which terrorists could use to create a dirty bomb. Essentially what a dirty bomb is a weapon that is composed of radioactive material unsanctioned by any government that has the intention to be used by terrorists. And number 4, building bridges. So no trust would ever be made if nuclear bombs keep them in a mutually assured destruction mentality. So one example for this would be, like, it is against human nature to trust one another if they feel threatened by one another, and the same applies to countries as well.
So some of this may seem pretty bleak, but fortunately there are people pushing to make a change. One of the primary contenders is ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Now, they are a non-governmental organization, and because of that, they are unbiased. They're not going to be doing anyone else's bidding. They're pushing for a world without nuclear weapons. 101 countries, including the United States, stands by them, as well as 468 partners. And their goal is to put into effect a treaty that will ban nuclear weapons in the way that, say, the Geneva Conventions ban chemical weapons. So some very important things happened within the past decade. In November 2011, the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement pushed for nuclear disarmament for nations. In May 2012, Switzerland had its first statement on humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, and 159 nations signed it. In August 2015, it was the Hiroshima and Nagasaki 70th anniversary. ICAN urges for the full pledge to the Non-Proliferation. And in August 2016, a special UN working group goes to Geneva to discuss achieving a world without nuclear weapons. So, as stated before, ICAN did win the Nobel Peace Prize last year. Now, they won for what they push, which is a world without nuclear weapons. There was a little bit of controversy surrounding this because obviously nothing major has happened. The global nuclear stockpile was going down, but that has stalled out, unfortunately. But to refute this whole controversy, I should say that, you got to take baby steps. We obviously didn't go to the moon in a day, so we're not going to get rid of all the nuclear weapons overnight.
And so now I will talk a little bit about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, also known as the TPN, or the Ban Treaty. And so currently 120 countries participate in the treaty. 57 have signed, and 5, I think now 6, have ratified, including Thailand, Mexico, Holy See, Guyana, and Cuba.
2 more nations have signed.
So the main goal of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is to prohibit the development, distribution, and threat from nuclear weapons. And on this graphic, on the red, are the countries that do possess nuclear weapons and have not signed or ratified the treaty. And in the yellow are those who do not own nuclear weapons and have signed the treaty. And there are currently 9 countries who do possess nuclear weapons, including the United States, Russia, China, the United Kingdom, France, Pakistan, India, Israel, and the United Kingdom. And North Korea, none of which have signed the TPN.
We're making sure you were listening.
So I've talked a little bit about the TPN, and now I'd like to talk a little about the NPT and some similarities and differences between the two. And so the NPT, or the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, has three main pillars, which are non-proliferation, disarmaments, and peaceful use. And so herein lies the main difference, one of the main difference between the NPT and the TPN. To give NPT some slack, it is an older treaty than the TPN, so that means that some of what it allows should be amended. But peaceful use, although it is a good idea, under peaceful use, under the category of peaceful use falls nuclear power plants, or the harnessing of nuclear energy, which, although provides a reliable power source, comes with dangers such as Chernobyl, as previously mentioned, or even Fukushima. And so now I will talk about some countries who have and who have not signed the TPN. So up first we have Austria, who has signed the TPN, and they have also attended negotiations with the UN. And so they are on board with this treaty, and currently they do not have any nuclear weapons.
Up next, we have China. Now, China did not negotiate the treaty and actually was participating in the boycott against it.
Up next is India, which, although they did not negotiate with the UN in regards to TPN, they do support the treaty. They just have not yet signed it. And India currently has 110 to 120 nuclear weapons.
This one's kind of upsetting. So Japan did not formally attend the meeting, stating that it would not be able to constructively negotiate, and has voted against the General Assembly. Now, there are reasons why, one of which is that it is under the U.S.'s nuclear umbrella, but still, it's kind of disappointing that Japan has not signed this treaty yet.
Okay, so moving on to the United States, and now very different from Austria, for example, or even India, who Austria has signed and India has supported the TPN. The United States has not participated with the United Nations regarding TPN. They have not signed the treaty, and they have recently stated that they never intend to join or never intend to sign the treaty. And this is very problematic, considering that the United States has 6,800, and probably more now, nuclear weapons.
The challenges to enforcing this treaty is that states disagree over how effectively you can stop nuclear weapons. Now, obviously, we can't, check every single nation, because the UN probably doesn't have enough people, but we can fix that. All countries must throw out their nuclear stockpiles within 60 days, whereas 9 non-signatory countries do not. Now, like I said before, you got to take baby steps. Now, if you have as many nuclear weapons as, say, Russia or the US, 60 days will not be enough. It's too time-consuming to get rid of the materials used to make the nuclear weapons, and it will be far too expensive to do it in that amount of time. And it does not state how to enforce these implements only safeguards.
So thank you for listening to our presentation. We're glad you attended, and please ask any questions you may have. Yes. Please ask a question you may have, one of you. And you don't, okay. Okay, well, thank you very much for listening.